Have you ever realized that the thing you treasured most about your childhood was actually the thing that damaged you the deepest? For as long as I can remember, my mother told me I was her best friend. Not her daughter. Not her little girl. Her best friend. When I was 6, she said it while brushing my hair before school. When I was 9, she whispered it after crying on the kitchen floor. When I was 12, she squeezed my hand and said, "You're the only person who truly understands me." I thought it was the greatest compliment a child could receive. I felt special, chosen, important. I carried those words like a badge of honor. While other kids were told to go play outside, I sat beside my mother listening to stories about her problems. While other children worried about homework and cartoons, I worried about whether mom was happy. And every time she called me her best friend, I felt proud. I thought it meant we had a bond nobody else could understand. I thought it meant I was loved more than anyone else. Then one day, at 34 years old, sitting in a therapist's office after my second panic attack that month, I finally understood what those words really meant. And in that moment, I had to grieve two things at once: the mother I thought I had, and the childhood I thought I remembered. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And welcome to Soft Drama Stories. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how my mother's favorite compliment became the heaviest burden of my life. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. From the outside, our family looked normal. My father worked long hours as an electrician. My mother stayed home. We lived in a modest 2-story house with white siding, a swing set in the backyard, and a maple tree that turned bright orange every autumn. Neighbors described us as close. Teachers described me as mature. Relatives described me as helpful. Nobody knew those descriptions were all connected. My earliest memory of being my mother's emotional support came when I was 5 years old. I remember sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet while she cried on the couch. I didn't understand why she was upset. I only knew that tears scared me. So I climbed onto the couch beside her. "Mommy, what's wrong?" She pulled me into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, you're such a good listener." Then she began telling me about a fight she'd had with my father. At 5 years old, I didn't understand marriage. I didn't understand finances. I didn't understand adult disappointment. But I understood one thing. My mother needed me, and making her feel better made me feel important. That became our pattern. As I grew older, the conversations became heavier. When I was 7, she complained about family members. When I was 9, she talked about money problems. When I was 11, she told me intimate details about arguments with Dad. When I was 13, she started discussing things no child should ever be responsible for carrying. Every conversation ended the same way. "You're my best friend, Emily." Those words became the reward. The emotional paycheck. The proof that I mattered. I didn't realize that children aren't supposed to earn love through emotional labor. I didn't realize that being needed and being loved aren't always the same thing. At school, I struggled to connect with kids my age. They seemed immature. They talked about movies and crushes. I spent my evenings listening to my mother's fears. I knew about unpaid bills. I knew about family conflicts. I knew about her loneliness. I knew about her disappointments. I knew things that belonged in adult conversations. Teachers praised my maturity. What they didn't see was the anxiety underneath it. By middle school, I felt responsible for everyone's emotions. If mom seemed sad, I felt guilty. If dad seemed angry, I felt responsible. If someone around me was unhappy, I immediately searched for ways to fix it. I became an expert at reading moods, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language. I could detect emotional shifts before anyone else noticed them. At the time, I thought it was a gift. Years later, I would learn it was survival. One evening when I was 14, I came home excited about making the varsity volleyball team. I had worked all summer for that moment. I burst through the front door, eager to tell my mother. But as soon as I saw her face, I knew something was wrong. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee. Immediately, my excitement disappeared. "What happened?" I asked. For the next 2 hours, she talked about her problems. When she finally finished, she looked at me and smiled. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled back. But that night, lying in bed, I realized I had never told her about the volleyball team. And somehow that felt normal. That was the first thing I lost. My own voice. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little pieces at a time. My feelings became secondary. My needs became negotiable. My dreams became interruptions. Because best friends listen. Best friends support. Best friends don't make things about themselves. At least that's what I believed. The older I got, the more my identity revolved around taking care of other people. Friends came to me with problems. Teachers relied on me. Coworkers depended on me. Boyfriends leaned on me. And I welcomed it. Because being needed felt familiar. Being needed felt like love. When I was 26, I met a man named Daniel. He was kind, thoughtful, and emotionally healthy. At first, I found him almost boring. That sounds terrible now. But chaos felt normal. Stability felt strange. One night, after listening to me describe another exhausting conflict with my mother, he asked a question that changed everything. Who takes care of you? I laughed. Nobody had ever asked me that. The question felt foreign, uncomfortable, almost selfish. What do you mean? I mean, he said gently, you spend all your time taking care of everyone else. Who takes care of Emily? I didn't have an answer. And that scared me. Because for the first time, I realized I had built my entire identity around being useful, not around being myself. Years later, after our marriage, after the panic attacks started, after chronic anxiety became impossible to ignore, I finally began therapy. I walked into that office believing we would discuss stress management. Instead, we discussed my childhood. Week after week, my therapist listened. Then one day she asked a question. What role did you play in your family? I answered immediately. I was my mother's best friend. The therapist became very quiet. Then she said words I will never forget. Emily, children are not supposed to be their parents' best friends. Everything inside me froze. Because suddenly dozens of memories rearranged themselves, not as evidence of love, but as evidence of responsibility, not as closeness, but as emotional dependence. And for the first time, I saw the difference. I spent the next several months grieving. Not because my mother was evil. She wasn't. Not because she didn't love me. I believe she did. But love and healthy parenting are not always the same thing. My mother gave me adult burdens before I had adult shoulders. She relied on me for comfort she should have sought from other adults. She unintentionally taught me that my value came from taking care of everyone else. And that realization broke my heart, because it forced me to mourn the version of my childhood I had always cherished. For a while, I left every therapy session feeling angry. Not at my mother, at myself. I kept replaying memories through this new lens, looking for evidence that I should have known sooner. How could I spend 34 years believing something that now seemed so obvious? How could I not see it? My therapist stopped me during one of those spirals. Emily, she said gently, children don't have the ability to evaluate their parents objectively. I stared at her. You accepted your childhood as normal because it was the only childhood you knew. That sentence sat with me for weeks. Because she was right. Children don't compare parenting styles. Children don't analyze family systems. Children adapt. Whatever environment they're given becomes their definition of normal. And my normal was being responsible for other people's emotions. Once I understood that, I began noticing how deeply that pattern had followed me into adulthood, especially in my marriage. Daniel had been pointing it out for years, not accusingly, not critically, just patiently. Whenever we argued, I immediately focused on his feelings. Whenever he was stressed, I dropped everything to help. Whenever I was upset, I minimized it. At first, he thought I was simply compassionate. Then he realized something wasn't right. One evening after dinner, he asked me a question. If you had a terrible day and I had a terrible day, whose problems matter more? I answered instantly. Yours. He frowned. Why? I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I genuinely didn't know. The answer felt obvious to me, but I couldn't explain it logically. Eventually, I shrugged. I don't know. Daniel looked sad. That's what worries me. The conversation stayed with me, because for the first time, I saw something I had never noticed before. I treated my own needs like inconveniences, not just occasionally, consistently, automatically, without thinking. If a friend needed help moving, I canceled my plans. If a coworker asked for a favor, I stayed late. If a relative called with a problem, I dropped everything. Meanwhile, my own exhaustion, stress, and feelings always went to the bottom of the list. I wasn't being generous. I was being conditioned. And there was a difference. The hardest realization came when I started examining my relationship with my mother in real time. Not childhood memories, present-day interactions. That's where things became impossible to ignore. Every phone call followed the same structure. The first 40 minutes focused entirely on her life, her worries, her frustrations, her disappointments, her conflicts. Then, near the end, she'd ask, "How are you?" Before I could answer, she'd remember another story and continue talking. For years, I never noticed. Now I couldn't stop noticing. One Sunday afternoon, she called while Daniel and I were driving home from a weekend trip. I put her on speaker. For nearly an hour, she talked. Daniel remained silent. After I hung up, he glanced at me. You never told her about your promotion. I blinked. What? You got promoted last week. I stared out the window. Somehow, during a 60-minute conversation, it had never come up, and neither of us had noticed until afterward. Because that wasn't unusual. That was normal. Or at least it had been. The next therapy session was difficult. I described the phone call. My therapist nodded. Then she asked something that felt impossible. What would happen if you stopped playing the role? I laughed nervously. What role? Your mother's emotional caretaker. The room went silent. My chest tightened. The idea felt dangerous, wrong, selfish, cruel, as if abandoning a child. Which made no sense because my mother wasn't a child. She was 63 years old. Yet my nervous system reacted as though her emotional well-being depended entirely on me. That was when I finally understood how deep the conditioning ran. Logically, I knew I wasn't responsible for her happiness. Emotionally, I felt completely responsible. The gap between those two realities became the focus of my healing. And healing turned out to be far messier than I expected. Movies make healing look inspiring. A breakthrough moment. A powerful realization. A triumphant transformation. Real healing looked more like grief. Messy, confusing grief. Because every healthy boundary felt like betrayal. The first boundary was small. Tiny, really. One evening, my mother called while Daniel and I were eating dinner. Normally, I would answer immediately. This time, I let it go to voicemail. My stomach twisted with guilt. For the next 30 minutes, I could barely focus on the meal. I kept imagining emergencies, disasters, hurt feelings, anger. When I finally listened to the voicemail, she simply wanted to tell me about a disagreement she'd had with a neighbor. Nothing urgent, nothing serious. Yet my body had reacted as though lives were at stake. That scared me, because it revealed how deeply I had been trained to prioritize her needs above everything else, including my own peace. The second boundary was harder. A few weeks later, she called while I was at work. I texted, busy right now. I'll call tonight. 5 minutes later, she responded, never mind. Just 2 words, but they landed like a punch. Years of conditioning translated those words instantly. You're disappointing me. You don't care about me. You're abandoning me. My therapist called this emotional programming. The old messages embedded beneath the surface. Messages that activate automatically. The challenge wasn't recognizing them. The challenge was refusing to obey them. That evening I called anyway. My mother answered with a wounded tone. Oh, now you have time? I felt 14 years old again. Small, guilty, responsible. For a moment I almost apologized. Then I stopped. Instead I said calmly, yes, I told you I'd call tonight. There was a pause. A long one. Then she changed the subject. The world didn't end. She survived. I survived. But afterward I cried in my car. Not because of the conversation. Because of what it represented. Every healthy boundary forced me to confront a painful truth. I had spent most of my life managing my mother's emotions, and now I was learning to stop. Around that time, another memory resurfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. I was 16. My high school was hosting a weekend trip to Chicago. I desperately wanted to go. All my friends were going. The cost wasn't the issue. Permission wasn't the issue. The problem was my mother. A week before the trip, she began mentioning how lonely she'd be, how much she'd miss me, how boring the weekend would feel. She never directly asked me to stay. She didn't have to. By Friday, I voluntarily gave up my spot. I told everyone I had changed my mind. The truth was simpler. I couldn't tolerate the guilt. For years, I remembered that story as proof of our closeness. Now I saw it differently. A teenager had sacrificed an important experience to protect her mother's feelings, and everyone involved considered that normal, including me. That realization hurt more than I expected, because grief isn't just sadness. Sometimes grief is anger. Sometimes grief is recognizing opportunities that were quietly stolen. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but stolen nonetheless. As therapy continued, I started noticing something else. I wasn't only grieving my childhood, I was grieving my mother. Not the real woman, the imagined version. The version I'd spent decades protecting. Children naturally idealize parents, even when those parents make mistakes. Especially when those parents make mistakes. The fantasy feels safer than reality. My fantasy was that my mother and I had a uniquely special bond. Reality was more complicated. Reality contained love, but it also contained dependency. Reality contained affection, but it also contained emotional burden. Reality contained connection, but it also contained role reversal. Accepting both truths at once felt impossible. Yet healing required exactly that, not demonizing her, not excusing everything, simply seeing clearly. One evening, I visited my parents for dinner. About halfway through the meal, my mother launched into another long complaint, this time about a family conflict. Normally, I would listen for hours, offer advice, provide comfort, absorb anxiety. Instead, I said something new. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that." Then I stopped. No solutions. No emotional rescue. No fixing. Just empathy. My mother blinked, clearly waiting for more. When more didn't come, she looked confused. The silence stretched. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the conversation. I wasn't carrying her emotions. I wasn't carrying the responsibility. The discomfort in that moment was enormous, but it was also strangely freeing, because I finally understood something. Support and responsibility are not the same thing. You can love someone without managing their life. You can care without carrying. You can listen without absorbing. That lesson changed everything. Not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. The more boundaries I practiced, the more space appeared inside my own life. Space for my feelings, space for my needs, space for my identity. And in that space, I began discovering someone I had never really met before. Myself. For most of my life, I knew exactly who everyone else needed me to be. The helper, the listener, the caretaker, the reliable one. But who was Emily when nobody needed rescuing? That question terrified me and excited me, because for the first time, I was finally free to find out. The strangest thing about healing was that nobody around me could see it happening. There was no dramatic transformation, no movie montage, no sudden confidence. Most days, the changes were invisible. A sentence I didn't say, a responsibility I didn't accept, a problem I didn't rush to solve. Tiny moments, tiny choices, tiny rebellions against patterns that had controlled my entire life. Yet those tiny choices were changing everything. The first person who noticed was Daniel. One Saturday morning, we were sitting on the back patio drinking coffee. The sun had barely risen. Birds chirped in the trees. For once, neither of us was rushing anywhere. My phone buzzed. "Mom." Immediately, my stomach tightened. Daniel noticed. I noticed him noticing. And then something unusual happened. I didn't answer. I simply placed the phone face down on the table. Daniel smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. But I knew exactly what it meant. He wasn't proud because I ignored my mother. He was proud because I had made a choice. A conscious choice. For most of my life, my reactions weren't choices. They were reflexes. Automatic responses created years earlier. Now I was learning something new. Pause. Think. Choose. It sounds simple. But for someone raised to prioritize another person's emotional needs above her own, it felt revolutionary. A few days later, my therapist asked me a question. "What do you enjoy doing?" I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I genuinely didn't know. The silence that followed felt embarrassing. 34 years old, college graduate, married, successful career, and I couldn't answer a basic question about myself. Eventually I said, "I like helping people." She smiled gently. "That's what you do. Not necessarily who you are." That hit harder than I expected, because she was right. Helping people wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a passion. It was a survival strategy, an identity built around being useful. When I got home, I sat alone in the living room thinking about that conversation. What did I enjoy? Not what I was good at. Not what people praised me for. Not what made me valuable. What actually brought me joy? The answer didn't come immediately. In fact, it took months. Months of experimenting. Months of paying attention. Months of learning that I was allowed to have preferences. One afternoon, I wandered into a local bookstore. Not because I needed anything. Not because someone asked me to go. Simply because I wanted to. The realization felt almost ridiculous. I wanted to. Those 3 words had rarely guided my decisions. For years, my choices revolved around obligation, responsibility, expectations. Now I was following curiosity. Inside the bookstore, I spent nearly 2 hours browsing. No agenda, no purpose, no productivity, just enjoyment. When I left carrying 3 novels and a cup of coffee, I felt strangely emotional. Not because of the books. Because it was one of the first times in my adult life that I had done something purely for myself. Most people learn that naturally as children. I was learning it at 34. Around the same time, my relationship with my mother entered a difficult phase. Not because I was becoming cruel, because I was becoming different. And people often struggle when familiar roles begin to change. For decades, our relationship operated according to an unspoken agreement. She shared. I listened. She worried. I reassured. She leaned. I supported. Now the arrangement was shifting. Without warning. Without her consent. And understandably, she didn't like it. One evening she called while I was cooking dinner. Within minutes, she began describing a conflict involving a relative. Normally, I would spend an hour analyzing every detail. Instead, I said, "That sounds stressful." Then I waited. She continued. I listened. But I didn't take ownership of the situation. Eventually, she asked, "What do you think I should do?" The old Emily would have immediately offered solutions. The new Emily paused, then answered honestly, "I don't know." Silence. A long silence. Finally, she said, "You always know what to say." There was sadness in her voice. Maybe disappointment too. And for a moment, guilt surged through me. The old conditioning activated instantly. Fix it. Make her feel better. Take responsibility. But underneath that urge was a new understanding. Her disappointment belonged to her, not me. That distinction became one of the most important lessons of my recovery. Other people's feelings matter, but they are not always my responsibility. The difference sounds obvious. Yet for someone raised as an emotional caretaker, it changes everything. Several weeks later, I experienced a breakthrough I never expected. It happened during a family gathering. The kind of gathering where everyone falls into familiar roles without realizing it. My father told jokes. My aunt organized food. My cousin entertained the children. And my mother complained. As usual. For years, I would have positioned myself beside her. Listening. Comforting. Managing. Instead, I found myself talking with my cousins. Laughing. Relaxing. Enjoying myself. Halfway through the afternoon, I noticed my mother watching me. Not angrily. Just watching. As though something felt different. Because something was different. For perhaps the first time in my life, I wasn't orbiting around her emotional state. I was participating in my own life. That realization brought both joy and grief. Joy because I was finally becoming my own person. Grief because I understood how much of myself I had missed. Therapy often felt like archaeology, digging through old layers, discovering buried truths. Some discoveries were painful. Others were surprising. One session focused on childhood memories. My therapist asked me to describe moments when I felt loved. At first, countless examples came to mind. Movie nights, road trips, holiday mornings, birthday parties. Then she asked another question. What happened when you were sad? I froze. The answer didn't arrive immediately. When it finally did, tears followed. Because I realized something devastating. Many of my childhood memories involved my mother sharing her feelings. Very few involved her helping me process mine. If I was hurt, the focus quickly shifted. If I was upset, her emotions often became the priority. If I cried, she sometimes cried harder. And suddenly, I understood why expressing needs felt so uncomfortable. Nobody had intentionally taught me to suppress myself. The lesson had emerged naturally, repeated thousands of times. My emotions created complications. Other people's emotions created purpose. One was discouraged. The other was rewarded. No wonder I became who I became. That realization didn't make me hate my mother. It made me sad for both of us. Because the older I got, the more I understood she had probably learned similar lessons herself, somewhere in her own childhood, somewhere long before I was born. Pain often travels through families quietly, not through cruelty, through repetition. Patterns pass down so naturally that nobody notices them, until someone does. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I visited my parents unexpectedly. My father was out. My mother and I sat together drinking tea. For once, neither of us seemed rushed. The conversation drifted between memories and ordinary topics. Then she said something that stopped me cold. I always felt like you understood me better than anyone. There was no manipulation in her voice, no strategy, just honesty. And for the first time, I heard the loneliness beneath those words. The loneliness of a woman who had depended too heavily on her child. Not because she wanted to hurt me, because she needed support she never learned how to find elsewhere. My chest tightened. Part of me wanted to explain everything. The therapy, the boundaries, the grief, the discoveries. But I wasn't ready. Instead, I simply nodded. And for the first time, I saw her clearly. Not as a villain, Not as a saint, just a human being. Flawed, complicated, wounded, trying her best with tools that weren't always enough. That realization didn't erase the damage, but it softened the anger. Healing isn't about deciding someone was entirely good or entirely bad. Healing is learning to hold multiple truths at once. My mother loved me. My mother depended on me too much. Both were true. My childhood contained beautiful memories. My childhood contained emotional burdens no child should carry. Both were true. Accepting those contradictions felt like learning a new language, one built on nuance instead of certainty. As months passed, my life continued changing in unexpected ways. I became less anxious. Not instantly, not completely, but noticeably. The constant feeling of responsibility began easing. The invisible weight grew lighter. And with that extra space came something unfamiliar. Anger. Not explosive anger. Not destructive anger. Healthy anger. The kind that says, that wasn't okay. The kind that protects instead of destroys. The kind I had spent decades suppressing. For most of my life, anger felt dangerous, selfish, disrespectful. Now I was learning it had a purpose. Anger highlights boundaries. Anger identifies violations. Anger points toward unmet needs. For someone who had ignored her own needs for decades, that was important information. Perhaps the most important information of all. Because healing wasn't simply about understanding the past. It was about building a different future. And for the first time, that future felt possible. The first time I truly disappointed my mother on purpose, I cried for 3 days. That probably sounds ridiculous, especially if you've never spent your life measuring your worth through someone else's approval. But for me, it felt enormous, terrifying, almost impossible. It happened 6 months after I started therapy. Daniel and I had planned a weekend trip to the mountains. Nothing extravagant. Just 3 days away. No work. No obligations. No schedules. A chance to breathe. The Tuesday before we were supposed to leave, my mother called. At first, the conversation felt normal. Then she mentioned that she was feeling lonely. A few minutes later, she mentioned it again. Then she reminded me that she hadn't seen me in almost 2 weeks. Then she casually suggested that maybe Daniel and I could postpone our trip. Not because of an emergency. Not because she needed help. Simply because she missed me. 20 years earlier, I would have canceled immediately. 10 years earlier, I would have canceled while pretending it was my own idea. Even 1 year earlier, I probably would have spent days drowning in guilt. This time I took a breath. Then I said something that felt revolutionary. We already made plans, Mom. Silence. The kind of silence that carries meaning. The kind designed to make you uncomfortable. The kind that used to work every single time. Eventually she sighed. Of course. The words themselves weren't harsh. But the tone landed exactly where she intended. Right inside my guilt. For a few seconds, I almost gave in. The old instincts rushed forward. Fix it. Make her happy. Sacrifice your plans. Protect her feelings. Then another voice appeared. A newer voice. A healthier one. Emily, you're allowed to have your own life. The realization felt so unfamiliar that it almost made me emotional. Allowed. Such a simple word. Yet it changed everything. Because deep down, I had never believed it. Not completely. Not really. I had always felt that my freedom depended on everyone else's happiness. If someone was upset, I wasn't free. If someone was disappointed, I wasn't free. If someone needed something, I wasn't free. The mountain trip became a test. A small but significant test. And for the first time, I passed. The entire drive there, I waited for disaster. I expected guilt to consume me. I expected panic. I expected constant anxiety. Instead, something unexpected happened. I relaxed. Not immediately, but gradually. By the second day, I found myself laughing more freely than I had in years. By the third day, I realized something that nearly brought me to tears. I wasn't thinking about managing anyone else's emotions. I was simply existing. And that felt extraordinary. When we returned home, my mother was fine. Lonely, perhaps. A little irritated, maybe. But fine. The catastrophe my nervous system had predicted never arrived. That became one of the biggest lessons of my recovery. Most of the disasters I feared existed only inside old conditioning, not reality. Reality was usually far less dramatic. Several months later, another challenge arrived. This one was harder. Much harder. It started with a family dinner. One of those evenings where conversations wander unpredictably. At some point, childhood stories came up. Everyone started sharing memories. Funny moments. Embarrassing moments. Family traditions. Then my mother smiled and said something she'd said hundreds of times before. Emily was always my best friend. The table laughed warmly. Several relatives nodded. Someone commented on how close we had always been. Years earlier, I would have smiled proudly. That phrase had once felt like a medal. This time, something inside me tightened. Not because anyone meant harm, because I finally understood what those words had cost. Nobody else noticed my reaction. But later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My best friend. The phrase echoed through my mind. And suddenly I found myself crying. Not dramatic sobbing, quiet grief. The kind that arrives when you finally acknowledge a loss you've been avoiding. Because being my mother's best friend had required giving up something else. The chance to simply be her child. A child gets comforted. A best friend provides comfort. A child gets protected. A best friend provides support. A child gets guidance. A best friend shares burdens. Without realizing it, I had spent years occupying the wrong role. Not entirely. Not constantly. But often enough to shape my identity. That realization hurt. Not because I hated my mother. Because I loved her. And grieving someone you love is complicated. Especially when they're still alive. One therapy session stands out more than any other. I had been describing this grief for nearly 20 minutes. The sadness. The confusion. The anger. The guilt. Eventually, I asked the question that had haunted me for months. Can I love her and still be hurt by what happened? My therapist answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation. No qualification. Just yes. I stared at her, and suddenly tears started falling. Because part of me had been waiting for permission. Permission to stop choosing sides. Permission to stop forcing everything into simple categories. Good mother or bad mother. Loved or unloved. Victim or villain. Reality rarely works that way. Most families exist somewhere in the complicated middle. Mine certainly did. My mother wasn't malicious. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't intentionally harmful. But intentions don't erase impact. And impact matters. That session marked a turning point. For the first time, I stopped trying to prove that my childhood was either wonderful or terrible. It had been both. And neither. It had been human. Messy. Complicated. Incomplete. Just like every family. The difference was that I could finally see it clearly. Around that time, Daniel noticed another change. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching television. Nothing important. Just an ordinary Tuesday night. Out of nowhere, he muted the screen and turned toward me. You seem happier. The comment surprised me. Because happiness wasn't how I would have described my healing journey. Healing felt painful, exhausting, emotional, sometimes overwhelming. Happier? I asked. He nodded. More present. I thought about that for a moment. Then I realized he was right. For years, part of my attention had always been elsewhere. Monitoring, managing, anticipating, scanning for emotional problems before they appeared. Now that constant vigilance was slowly fading, not disappearing entirely, but easing, and the energy it consumed was becoming available for other things. For joy, for curiosity, for connection, for life. One afternoon, I experienced a moment I'll never forget. I was walking through a local park after work. Nothing special about the day. No major breakthrough. No dramatic realization. Just a quiet evening. Children played near a fountain. Couples walked their dogs. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass. And suddenly I noticed something. I felt calm. Not distracted. Not worried. Not responsible for anyone. Just calm. The feeling lasted maybe 30 seconds. Yet it felt profound. Because calm had always been temporary in my life. A brief pause before the next responsibility. The next crisis. The next emotional burden. Now it felt different. Stable. Real. Earned. I sat on a nearby bench and cried. Not from sadness. From relief. 34 years. 34 years of carrying responsibilities that were never mine. 34 years of confusing usefulness with worth. 34 years of believing love required self-sacrifice. And now, little by little, those beliefs were loosening their grip. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And perhaps most importantly, it was sustainable. Because healing isn't becoming a different person. It's becoming yourself. The person who existed underneath all the survival strategies. The person who existed before the conditioning. The person who deserved space all along. As the first anniversary of therapy approached, I began noticing something remarkable. The grief was changing. It wasn't disappearing, but it was evolving. Less sharp, less overwhelming, more integrated. Like a scar instead of an open wound. The sadness remained, but it no longer controlled me. And in its place, something new was growing. Compassion. Not only for my mother, for myself. For the little girl who believed being needed was the same thing as being loved. For the teenager who sacrificed pieces of herself to keep everyone comfortable. For the young woman who spent decades earning affection she already deserved. Most of all, compassion for the child who never realized she was carrying adult burdens. Because none of it was her fault. She was just doing what children do. Adapting, surviving, loving the best way she knew how. And finally, after all these years, someone was taking care of her. Me. A year after I started therapy, I made a decision that terrified me. I decided to tell my mother the truth. Not all of it. Not every painful realization. Not every detail. But enough. Enough to stop pretending. Enough to finally speak honestly. For months I had gone back and forth. Part of me wanted to protect her. Part of me wanted to avoid conflict. Part of me worried I was overreacting. Part of me feared I would hurt her unnecessarily. But beneath all those fears was a deeper truth. I was exhausted. Exhausted from carrying the story alone. Exhausted from acting like nothing had changed. Exhausted from pretending I wasn't grieving. My therapist never told me what to do. She simply asked questions. One of them stayed with me. What would happen if your mother never understood? At first, I hated the question. Because I wanted understanding. I wanted validation. I wanted her to look at me and say, "You're right. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have carried that." I wanted the kind of closure people get in movies. The kind wrapped neatly in tears and apologies. But real life rarely works that way. Eventually, I realized something important. The conversation wasn't about changing her. It was about freeing myself. And those are very different goals. So, one Sunday afternoon, I drove to my parents' house. Alone. No Daniel. No buffer. No distraction. Just me. The entire drive, my hands shook. I rehearsed 100 different versions of the conversation. Every version sounded wrong. Every version felt impossible. When I arrived, my mother greeted me warmly. Coffee was already brewing. Cookies sat on the counter. Everything looked exactly the same. Which somehow made the moment harder. Because from the outside, nothing appeared broken. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had listened to her worries for most of my childhood. The same table where I had learned to become her comforter. The same table where I had slowly disappeared. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Weather. Family. Work. Then I finally said it. "Mom, there's something important I'd like to talk about." Immediately, she looked concerned. "What is it?" My heartbeat thundered inside my chest. I took a breath. Then another. Then I began. I've been learning a lot in therapy. The moment the word therapy appeared, I saw uncertainty cross her face. Not hostility, just caution. I continued carefully. "I've realized there were times growing up when I felt responsible for your feelings." Silence. A long silence. She stared at me, confused. Then she laughed softly. "What do you mean?" The reaction didn't surprise me. To her, the statement probably sounded absurd. I understood that. So I explained. Gently. Slowly. The conversations. The emotional dependence. The pressure I had carried. The role I had played. I chose my words carefully. Not accusations. Not attacks. Just honesty. For nearly 20 minutes, I spoke. When I finally finished, the kitchen felt impossibly quiet. My mother looked down at the table, then out the window, then back at me. And what she said next broke my heart. "I thought we were close." Tears instantly filled my eyes. Because that was exactly the problem. We had been close. Very close. But closeness and healthy boundaries aren't the same thing. And explaining that distinction felt nearly impossible. "I know we were close," I said softly. "I loved being close to you." Then why does it sound like something bad? There it was. The misunderstanding I had feared. The assumption that acknowledging hurt meant rejecting love. I shook my head. "No, that's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" The question hung between us. And suddenly I realized there wasn't a perfect answer. There never would be. Because some truths are too complicated to fit into neat explanations. Eventually I said, "I'm saying I needed a mother sometimes. And a lot of the time I felt like a friend." The words landed heavily. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Not defensive tears. Not angry tears, sad tears, the kind that come from genuine pain. I never meant to hurt you. The moment she said it, I believed her. Completely. And somehow that made everything harder. Because life would be simpler if harmful people always had harmful intentions. But they don't. Sometimes people hurt others while trying to love them. Sometimes wounds come from limitations rather than malice. Sometimes both people leave carrying pain. That afternoon, nobody received perfect closure. Nobody delivered a dramatic speech. Nobody solved decades of history. Instead, we sat together and cried. Not because we agreed on everything, because we loved each other, and because love doesn't erase pain. A few weeks later, my mother called. The conversation felt different. Subtly, not dramatically, but noticeably. At one point, she stopped herself mid-story, then asked, "How are you doing?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I almost gave my usual answer. Fine. Good. Everything's okay? Then I stopped and told the truth, actually told the truth, about work stress, about anxiety, about challenges, about life. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I allowed myself to occupy space. Not all the space, just some. And she listened. Not perfectly, not forever, but genuinely. When we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes, because something had shifted, not transformed, shifted. And sometimes that's enough. Healing relationships rarely happens through grand gestures. More often, it happens through small corrections repeated consistently. A different question, a healthier boundary, a more honest conversation. Tiny changes accumulating over time. The following months weren't perfect. Some conversations went badly. Some boundaries triggered tension. Some old patterns returned. Growth is rarely linear, but progress was happening. For both of us. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after beginning therapy, I found myself looking through old photo albums. Pictures covered the living room floor. Birthday parties, school concerts, family vacations, Christmas mornings, smiling faces frozen in time. As I flipped through the pages, I expected grief. Instead, I felt something surprising. Affection. Not denial, not revisionist history. Affection. Because the photographs reminded me of something important. My childhood wasn't a lie. The happy moments were real. The love was real. The connection was real. The pain was real too. Both things could exist simultaneously. For years, I thought I had to choose. Either my childhood was wonderful or it was damaging. Either my mother was loving or she was harmful. Either I was grateful or I was wounded. Therapy taught me otherwise. Human beings are more complicated than that. Families are more complicated than that. Life is more complicated than that. The truth usually lives somewhere in the middle. And maturity means learning to tolerate that complexity. One evening, Daniel and I sat together watching the sunset from our backyard. The sky glowed orange and gold. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, comfortable. Out of nowhere, he asked, "If you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?" The question caught me off guard. For a while, I simply stared at the horizon, thinking, remembering, feeling. Then I answered, I'd tell her she doesn't have to earn love. The words surprised even me, because they contained everything. Every lesson, every breakthrough, every painful realization, every piece of healing. You don't have to earn love. Not through perfection. Not through sacrifice. Not through caretaking. Not through fixing everyone else's problems. Not through disappearing. Real love doesn't require you to abandon yourself. Real love makes room for you. The child I once was never understood that. She thought being needed was the highest form of connection. She thought her worth depended on usefulness. She thought other people's happiness was her responsibility. And honestly, she did the best she could. She survived. She adapted. She loved fiercely. I don't blame her for any of it. I admire her. Because carrying those burdens wasn't easy. Yet she carried them anyway. The difference now is that she isn't carrying them alone. Or carrying them at all. Not anymore. Today, when my mother calls, I answer because I want to. Not because I feel obligated. Today, when she shares her problems, I listen without absorbing them. Today, when I need support, I ask for it. Today, when someone is disappointed with me, I survive. Today, when I feel joy, I allow myself to experience it fully. These changes may sound small, but for someone who spent 3 decades living for everyone else, they feel enormous. Sometimes people ask what healing looks like. I used to think healing meant becoming fearless. Now I know better. Healing means living honestly, even when fear remains. Healing means choosing yourself without abandoning others. Healing means recognizing old wounds without letting them define your future. Most of all, healing means grieving what happened while still embracing what comes next. And that's why the title of this story remains true. The day I understood what my mother's words really meant, I had to grieve two things at once: the mother I thought I had, and the childhood I thought I remembered. But eventually, I discovered something else. Grief wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because once the illusion disappeared, something better became possible: truth. And from truth came freedom. From freedom came healing. And from healing came a life that finally belonged to me. My name is Emily Carter, and for the first time in my life, I am not my mother's best friend. I am her daughter, and that has made all the difference. The end.